Spain won the World Cup. So was the Messi 9 reading wrong? I do not think so. I think it was pointing at the right emotional truth, but at a deeper level than the scoreboard. Tonight, I want to talk about why Messi's ending energy still mattered even after Spain beat Argentina 1-0 after extra time on July 19th, 2026. Because a lot of people hear numerology in a very flat way. They assume that if a number points toward closure, then the player carrying the strongest legacy energy must also carry the trophy. But that is not how symbolic systems always work. Sometimes a number describes who wins the object. Sometimes it describes what kind of emotional event the object must pass through before it changes hands. And that difference is everything here. This is symbolic storytelling, not science or betting advice. Football still belongs to tactics, concentration, fatigue, pressure, execution, and all the decisions made inside the match itself. But symbolic reading can help us understand why a final feels the way it feels, and why some defeats still look central to the meaning of the night. Messi was central to the meaning of this final that did not disappear when Spain lifted the trophy. In some ways, Spain's victory made it clearer. Let us go back to the number that shaped the earlier reading. The full date of the final, July 19th, 2026, reduces to 9. 9 is closure, culmination, ending, release, emotional reckoning, farewell, and the gathering of a long story into a final understandable shape. 9 is not just loss. Very often, 9 is completion. It is the point where something has fully become itself and can now be remembered as a whole. That is why 9 felt so heavy before the match. And if you watch the final with that in mind, the emotional atmosphere still looked deeply 9-like. The game was tense. The stakes felt enormous. The emotional weight was older than the 90 minutes. The entire match carried that sense of history pressing inward, as if the night were not only about a trophy, but about the last full accounting of an era people had already been living inside for years. That atmosphere matters, because 9 does not only ask who gets the cup, it asks what is ending, so that the cup can mean something larger than itself. That is where Messi comes in. Messi entered this final not merely as a great player, but as a completed mythology. He was not being watched as a prospect. He was not being watched as a new possibility. He was being watched as a life in football that had already accumulated enough meaning to make every gesture feel larger than the moment itself. That is profoundly 9-like territory. People did not watch Messi in this final the way they watch a normal player. They watched him like a text nearing its last page. Every touch felt like it could become part of the closing image. Every pause felt legible. Every reaction carried memory. That is exactly what 9 does. It turns present-time action into retrospective meaning even before the event is over. So when Spain won, did that erase the 9? No, it fulfilled it in a harsher way. Because the 9 was never required to give Messi the trophy. It was required to make the final feel like the completion of something bigger than the trophy. And it absolutely did. That is the first truth of E08. Now, let us bring the scoreline into the picture. Spain won 1-0. 1-0 reduces to 1. 1 is beginning, emergence, authorship, naming, and the first line of a news cycle. In other words, the result itself behaved like a number of opening, not closing. At first glance, that may seem like a contradiction. How can the date be 9 while the score is 1? The answer is that they are describing two different layers of the same event. 9 closed the old room. 1 opened the next room. That is not a contradiction at all. It is one of the most elegant symbolic combinations a final can produce. Think about what actually happened. The match did not become a messy fireworks show. It did not become a random shootout of competing impulses. It stayed tight. It stayed heavy. It stayed serious. It carried the emotional drag of legacy. And then, only after all of that weight had fully settled over the game, Spain finally wrote a 1 onto the scoreboard and walked through the new door. That is exactly how endings and beginnings often work in real life. The old chapter does not vanish first. And then the new one starts in a clean, empty space. The old chapter reaches completion. And that very completion makes room for the new beginning. 9 then 1. That is the structure. And Messi was the human center of the 9. That is why saying the earlier reading was wrong misses the whole point. The reading was not mainly telling us Messi must win. It was telling us this final will be emotionally governed by completion, closure, and the last full weight of an older football narrative. That happened. It happened even more strongly because Spain, the symbol of movement and transition, had to win by passing through Messi's shadow rather than avoiding it. That is why Spain's triumph feels bigger than a simple upset or tactical success. It feels like a historical transfer. And transfers require both sides. The future is not real until it passes through the completed form of what came before it. Messi represented that completed form. That is why his role remained central even in defeat. Now, let us look again at the full date 9 and why it fit him so naturally. 9 is interested in summing up. It asks questions like, what did the whole story mean? What must now be released? What is finally becoming whole? What image will remain when the event is over? Messi's entire public football existence is unusually vulnerable to those questions because his career has long since moved beyond normal athletic evaluation. With him, people are always also asking meaning questions. Not only what happened, but what does this say about the whole era? That is why he was such a natural center of gravity for a 9 final. Yamal, by contrast, carried far more 1 energy. He represented arrival, naming, future claim, and the speed at which a new force can become visible. That made him a natural figure for what comes next. But 9 does not naturally belong to what comes next. 9 belongs to what must first become complete before the next thing can fully take over. This is why the final could belong to Spain, without invalidating Messi's symbolic role. Spain won the future. Messi held the ending. Those are not the same job. And a World Cup final is large enough to contain both. Now add Spain's own 23/5 energy. 5 is movement, disruption, youth, transition, and the refusal to stay inside an inherited frame. That made Spain the strongest candidate to carry the tournament's future-facing current. When Spain won, 5 was not denying 9. It was entering after 9 had done its work. 5 did not erase closure. It inherited the space that closure created. That is why the result feels so complete symbolically. It is also worth looking back at Argentina's 44/8 here, because that earlier line did not suddenly become nonsense. 8 still absolutely described part of the night. 8 described the burden, the authority, the weight, the trophy pressure, and the seriousness of the occasion. That is why the final never felt playful for long. It felt costly. It felt measured. It felt like every mistake belonged to consequence. That was 8 all over the stadium. But 8 is not always the same thing as transition. Sometimes 8 is the old structure at its most dignified. Sometimes 8 is the established order taking one final full breath before something more mobile enters the room. That is why Argentina could still look symbolically powerful and still lose the object. The 8 helped create the gravity that made the occasion worthy of transfer. In that sense, Argentina did not invalidate the reading by losing. Argentina completed the heavyweight frame that the new era needed in order to feel real when it finally arrived. That is one reason Spain's win feels so historically heavy rather than merely youthful. It did not walk past cardboard authority. It walked past the full championship architecture of an 8-shaped opponent, and that made the one on the scoreboard feel more expensive and more official. The full emotional logic of the final was something like this. First, 9 gathers the old era and makes everyone feel its weight. Then 1 appears on the scoreboard and opens the next page. Then 5 claims the movement of the tournament and carries that new page forward. That is a beautiful sequence, and Messi is still essential to it because without a real center of legacy, the 9 would not have had the same force. We should also talk about the pace of the match. The goal came in the 106th minute. 106 reduces to 7. 7 often behaves like a hidden answer number. It delays revelation. It makes the truth arrive later, deeper, and less obviously than people expect. That matters here because regulation time did not settle the symbolic argument. The match had to keep going. The ordinary frame had to run out. Then the new page opened. That is incredibly important for understanding Messi's role. If Spain had scored early, and the whole final had felt carefree and future-drunk from the opening whistle, the 9 reading would feel much weaker. But it did not feel like that. The game stayed burdened. The answer was delayed. The night kept asking to be interpreted through gravity first. Only after the gravity fully existed did the future break through. That sequence is almost perfect. It says the old story was not discarded. It was completed. And only then did the next story become official. That is why I would never describe Messi's symbolic presence in this final as disproven. If anything, he was the necessary gate. He was the last great completed figure standing in front of the next cycle. And Spain's victory meant the next cycle had enough force to pass through that gate. That is a very different statement from saying the gate was fake. Now think emotionally about what people will remember from this final in 10 years. They will remember that Spain won. They will remember that the younger energy finally took the trophy. But they will also remember the emotional frame in which that happened. They will remember the sense that the match was carrying more than one team's future. It was carrying the last heavy shadow of a football age defined by Messi's meaning. That is 9. 9 does not need a happy ending to be real. It needs a completed ending. Sometimes completion is triumphant. Sometimes it is painful. Sometimes it is simply unmistakable. This final was unmistakable. That is why E08 exists. Not to rescue an old prediction. Not to pretend defeat was secretly victory, but to explain the difference between a result reading and an atmosphere reading. The result reading now belongs more clearly to Spain's 23/5 and to the 1 on the scoreboard. The atmosphere reading still belongs to 9, and 9 still belongs most naturally to the completed legacy figure around whom the emotional meaning of the night kept organizing itself. That figure was Messi. There is one more reason this matters. A lot of people think symbolic systems only have value if they produce a winner pick. I think that is too small. Their deeper value is often that they show us the architecture of experience. They help explain why one final feels like youthful chaos, another feels like pure power, and another feels like a completed chapter even before the cup is lifted. This final felt like a completed chapter. And that is exactly why Spain's one energy beginning landed with so much force. A new page only feels truly historical when the book behind it has just finished a real chapter. Messi gave the night that finished chapter weight. Spain gave it the new sentence. That is the cleanest way to say it. Messi was not the trophy. He was the final paragraph before the new heading. That may sound poetic, but numerologically it is also precise. 9 closes. 1 begins. 5 moves. All 3 happen here. So why did Messi's ending energy still matter after Spain won? Because the full date 9 was not about handing him a guaranteed crown. It was about making the entire final feel like the emotional completion of a football era in which his presence remained central even when the next generation finally broke through. Because 1-0 put a 1 on the board, but only after the match had fully accepted the weight of closure first. Because Spain's future-facing energy became more meaningful, not less, when it had to emerge through a genuinely heavy 9 atmosphere. And because defeat does not remove someone from the meaning of a final when the whole event is still arranged around that person's legacy gravity. If you want the shortest possible version of E08, it is this. Spain won the future. Messi held the ending. The scoreboard opened a new page. The date closed an old book. That is why the Messi 9 readings still mattered. It was never only about who lifted the trophy. It was about how the era had to end before the next one could become real. And on July 19th, 2026, that ending finally happened in full public view. Thank you for spending this time with Hidden Number Files, and take care until we meet again.